Joy's smirk widened as she leaned back in her chair, clearly enjoying the tension she had ignited. "So which is it?" Joy Behar continued, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "The entire industry is lying, or you just can't handle criticism." That was the moment the air changed. Vin Diesel let out a slow breath, the kind people take right before saying something they can't take back. He leaned forward, eyes locked on Joy, his voice no longer measured but controlled in a far more dangerous way. "You're not holding me accountable," he said quietly. "You're performing, and you're doing it at my expense." A murmur rippled through the audience down to the table. Whoopi Goldberg finally raised her hand. "Okay, let's slow this down," but Joy cut her off. "No, Whoopi, this is a conversation," she insisted. "Viewers deserve honesty, not another carefully managed Hollywood image." That was the breaking point. Vang straightened in his seat, his chair scraping loudly against the studio floor. Every camera instinctively zoomed in. "You want honesty?" he shot back. "Here it is. I've carried a billion-dollar franchise on my back for over 2 decades. I've shown up for my crews, protected my cast, and fought studios to keep people employed. And you reduce all of that to gossip because it makes good TV." He paused, then delivered the line that sent shockwaves through social media. "You don't want answers, Joy. You want a headline." Silence. Even Joy seemed momentarily caught off guard. She recovered quickly. "So you're saying everyone else, Dwayne Johnson, Michelle Rodriguez, directors, crew members, they're all wrong?" Ven stood fully. "Now I'm saying complex situations don't fit into your sound bites," he said. "And I won't let you turn my life's work into a punchline." The control room reportedly panicked. Producers signaled frantically for a commercial break. The audience sat frozen, unsure whether they were witnessing television history or a complete collapse as Vang removed his microphone. He turned back one final time. "This was supposed to be about celebrating film," he said. "Not tearing people down for sport." And he walked off the set of The View, leaving stunned co-hosts, dead air, and a moment that would dominate headlines for weeks. Clips exploded online, comment sections went to war, and fans of the Fast and Furious star debated one question endlessly: did Vin Diesel finally say what every celebrity wishes they could live on air? "This is exactly what I mean," Joy Behar snapped, her tone no longer playful, no longer teasing, but openly hostile. "You can't handle criticism. You surround yourself with yes-men who tell you what you want to hear. And the moment someone dares to tell you the truth, you throw a tantrum like a spoiled child." That sentence didn't just land, it detonated. For a split second, time itself seemed to slow. Cameras kept rolling, red lights glowing, but the atmosphere in the studio shifted in a way that everyone could feel in their bones. This wasn't banter anymore. This wasn't a heated debate. This was personal. Vin Diesel, a man who had built an entire career portraying unbreakable figures, leaders who never backed down, men who lived by loyalty and respect, sat perfectly still, his face hardened, his jaw clenched. The movie star smile vanished completely. When he finally spoke, his voice dropped to a low, controlled growl. It wasn't loud, but it was far more dangerous than shouting. "You want to know what's toxic?" Vang said slowly, every word deliberate. "What's toxic is sitting behind that desk and tearing people down for ratings. What's toxic is inviting someone onto your show under the guise of a conversation, then ambushing them with personal attacks." The audience barely breathed. Vang leaned forward, his eyes locked on Joy. "You want to talk about unprofessional behavior? How about doing zero research and repeating garbage straight from gossip blogs? How about confusing rumors with facts and calling it journalism?" Around the table, the other hosts looked like they wanted to disappear. Sarah N stared down at her hands, fingers interlocked so tightly her knuckles turned white. Sunny Hostin shifted uncomfortably in her chair, her expression frozen somewhere between shock and dread. At the head of the table, Whoopi Goldberg opened her mouth as if to intervene, then hesitated, clearly unsure how to regain control of a conversation that was rapidly spiraling out of reach. But Joy wasn't done in what producers would later describe as a catastrophic miscalculation. She leaned in even closer, her voice sharp, cut-in, and merciless. "You know what, Vin," she said, "maybe the problem isn't that I'm asking tough questions. Maybe the real problem is that you can't handle the truth about who you really are. Behind all those muscles and that tough guy acting, you're just an insecure man who can't deal with reality." This studio erupted, not with applause, but with a collective gasp so loud it seemed to suck the oxygen out of the room. Even the camera operators froze. Years of live television experience told them they were witnessing something rare, something raw, something that couldn't be walked back once it crossed the line. Vang stood up so fast his chair nearly toppled over behind him as a massive frame towered over the table as he leaned toward Joy, one hand braced against the surface. His voice rose not into screaming but into a barely controlled roar that made everyone instinctively lean back. "You don't know the first thing about me," he thundered, pointing directly at her. "Not one thing. Security personnel shifted nervously at the edges of the set. You'll sit there in your bubble, Vang continued, throwing stones at people who actually work for a living, people who actually build something, create something meaningful. Joy's smile was gone. Now, you want to talk about insecurity? Vang pressed on, his voice cutting through the studio like a blade. Let's talk about someone whose entire career is built on tearing others down because they're too bitter and too talentless to build anything themselves. The words hung in the air like smoke after an explosion. For perhaps the first time in her decades-long television career, Joy Behar was speechless. Her face went pale, then red, then an unmistakable shade of purple as the weight of Vin's words landed. When she finally spoke, her voice was shaken not with sarcasm this time, but with raw rage. "How dare you?" she whispered. "How dare you come on my show and talk to me like that? Security should throw you out right now." Vang let out a short, bitter laugh. "Your show," he shot back. "This isn't your show. This is supposed to be a place for conversation, not a setup, not an ambush, not a playground for someone who gets kicks out of destroying people on live television." Producers were now openly signaling for a commercial break. Stage managers waved frantically. A control room buzzed with panic, but it was too late. The damage was done as Vang reached down and unclipped his microphone. He delivered one final line that would echo across social media for weeks. "You want conflict," he said. "Congratulations, you've got it." He turned and walked off the set of The View, leaving behind stunned co-hosts, dead air, and a moment of television history that no one in that studio would ever forget. Within minutes, clips flooded the internet. Comment sections exploded. Fans and critics clashed over one burning question. Did Vin Diesel finally say what so many guests were too afraid to say? Or did he cross a line that could change his career forever? For a moment that felt far longer than it actually was. The studio sat frozen in chaos. Then, finally, Whoopi Goldberg found her voice. She leaned forward, palms raised, her tone firm but strained as she attempted to pull the show back from the edge. Okay, Whoopi said, forcing calm into her words. "Let's all take a breath here, Vang. Please sit down, Joy. Maybe we should move on." But it was already too late. Joy Behar was no longer interested in de-escalation. Vin's words had clearly struck a nerve, and instead of retreating, she lunged forward with open hostility. Her face hardened, her voice sharp and venomous. "Has been," Joy snapped. "I've been on television longer than you've been making those ridiculous car movies. At least I don't have to rely on CGI and explosions to cover up a complete lack of talent." The reaction was immediate and visceral. Gasps rippled through the audience like a shockwave. Some people instinctively covered their mouths. Others raised their phones, hands shaken, desperate to capture what they knew instinctively was an unprecedented moment of live television unraveling in real time. Nervous murmurs filled the studio, rising and falling like static dot in the control room. Producers were undoubtedly panicking. Decades of experience had taught them how fragile live television could be, and right now, their carefully managed daytime talk show was imploding before their eyes. Then came Vin's response. It wasn't loud. It wasn't explosive. It was ice cold. Vin Diesel straightened slowly, his eyes never leaving Joy. When he spoke, his voice was calm, controlled, and devastating. "Talent," Vin said quietly. "You want to talk about talent?" He gestured, slightly with one hand, as if laying out undeniable facts. "I've built a franchise that made billions of dollars and employed thousands of people. I've created characters that inspire kids all over the world. Characters that teach loyalty, family, and resilience." He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. "What have you done?" he continued. "Besides, sit behind that desk, spreading negativity." The audience fell silent again. "When was the last time you created anything that made people feel good?" Vang asked, instead of tearing them down for entertainment. At the table, the tension was unbearable. Sarah N., clearly shaken, finally tried to intervene. Her voice trembled slightly as she leaned forward, attempting to redirect the conversation to safer ground. Maybe we should focus on the positive aspects of Vin's film," she suggested carefully. "Can we talk about the message of family and loyalty?" Joy whipped her head towards Sarah so fast it made her flinch. "Don't you dare change the subject," Joy snapped. "This man just insulted me on national television. I'm not pretending this is some friendly chat about movies." That was when Vang slammed his hand down on the table. The sound was sharp and violent, echoing through the studio like a gunshot. Water glasses jumped. Microphones rattled. The audience recoiled. "You started this," Vang said, his voice now cutting and unmistakably furious. "You invited me here under false pretenses and tried to destroy me with lies and gossip." He leaned forward, towering over the table. "You want to dish it out?" he continued. "But you can't take it when someone fights back." Joy shot back immediately, her voice shrill with anger. "I asked legitimate questions about your professional behavior. If you can't handle basic accountability, maybe you shouldn't be in the public eye." Vang laughed once short. "Humorless. Legitimate questions. he repeated sharply. You ambushed me with tabloid trash and personal attacks. You didn't ask questions, you made accusations. His voice cracked through the microphones. There's a difference, he said. And if you were a real journalist instead of a glorified gossip columnist, you'd know that. A collective gasp swept through the studio at this point. Sunny Hostin attempted a diplomatic intervention, speaking carefully, as though choosing each word could prevent the situation from completely collapsing. I think what Joy was trying to explore, Sunny said cautiously, is accountability in Hollywood and how celebrities handle criticism. But the effort felt fragile, almost futile. The energy in the room had shifted beyond control. This was no longer a discussion. It was a collision between two people unwilling to back down, broadcast live to millions. Producers signaled frantically for a commercial break. Floor managers whispered urgently through headsets. But the damage was already done. This wasn't just another heated exchange. This was a moment that would be dissected, debated, and replayed endlessly across social media. Moment that forced viewers to ask an uncomfortable question. Was this a celebrity meltdown? Or the moment someone finally pushed back against a system built on confrontation for ratings? And as the cameras kept rolling on The View, one thing was undeniable. Daytime television had crossed a line it could never fully erase. For the first time since the confrontation began, Vin Diesel's expression softened just slightly. The fire in his eyes dimmed enough to show something else beneath it. Exhaustion. He turned his head toward Sunny Hostin, acknowledging her. An attempt to bring reason back into a situation that was clearly spiraling. Sunny, I appreciate that, Vin said, his voice calmer but still tight with emotion. But there's a difference between criticism and character assassination. I've been in this business for over 2 decades. I've done thousands of interviews. I know the difference between a tough question and a hit job. For a brief moment, it seemed like the storm might finally break, but Joy Behar couldn't let it go. This was a woman who had built her career on sharp wit, confrontation, and above all having the last word. She leaned forward again, eyes narrowed, voice rising with indignation. Character assassination. Joy shot back. You're the one who called me bitter and talentless on national television. You're the one having a complete meltdown because someone dared to ask you tough questions. Her words reignited the fire instantly. Vang spun toward her, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. His eyes blazed with fury, so intense that everyone in the studio instinctively leaned back. Even the audience could feel that this wasn't performance. This wasn't acting. This was raw, tough questions. Vang snapped. Lady, you didn't ask about my work. You didn't ask about my craft, my experiences, or anything meaningful. He leaned forward, pointing toward the table. You came at me with gossip, he continued, his voice rising. You came at me with rumors. You tried to humiliate me on live television. The room felt smaller, heavier. And if you want to see a meltdown, Vang added slowly, his tone dropping into something unmistakably threatening, keep pushing me. A chill swept through the studio. This wasn't bravado. This wasn't publicity. This was a man standing on the edge of his breaking point, barely containing a rage that had been building for years. At the head of the table, Whoopi Goldberg made one last desperate attempt to regain control. Her voice carried authority, but it was strained like someone trying to stop a train with bare hands. Whoopi said firmly, I need you to lower your voice. Joy, take it down a notch. We're on live television. We need to remember our audience. For a split second there was hope. Then Joy responded, and whatever chance remained vanished. I'm not taking anything down, Joy snapped. This man came onto our show and showed his true colors. America deserves to see who he really is when he doesn't get his way. The words hit like a slap. That was the final straw of Vin's composure, already hanging by a thread, snapped completely. He leaned across the table, so close that Joy instinctively pressed herself back into a chair. Security tensed. Producers froze. The audience held its breath. When Veng spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper, and it was more terrifying than any shout. You want America to see who I really am, he said slowly. Fine. He held her gaze unblinking. Someone who believes in respect, Veng continued, in treating people with dignity, in building instead of destroying. His voice never rose. It didn't need to. I believe in lifting people up, he said, not tearing them down for entertainment. Then his tone hardened. You want to know who you really are, he asked quietly. You hide behind that desk and destroy people for ratings. You tear others apart because it's easier than looking at yourself. The studio was utterly silent. You're so miserable with your own life, Veng finished, that you make everyone else miserable too. The words hung in the air like smoke after an explosion. Joy's face flushed a deep, angry red, whether from embarrassment or pure rage. No one could tell. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. For once she had nothing to say. Around her, the other hosts looked stunned. Sunny stared straight ahead, lips pressed tightly together. Sarah N. avoided eye contact entirely. Even Whoopi looked shaken, her usual composure cracked by the sheer intensity of what had just unfolded in the control room. Producers were undoubtedly scrambling, knowing they had just witnessed a moment that could never be undone. This wasn't a heated interview. This wasn't a celebrity clash. This was a public reckoning played out live, with nowhere to hide. And as the cameras continued to roll on The View, one truth became impossible to ignore, whatever side viewers took. Daytime television would never look the same again. The words exploded from Joy Behar, her voice sharp and panicked, slicing through the heavy silence in the studio. She raised her hands defensively, her chair scraping backward as she pressed herself away from the table. "This is harassment. This is intimidation," she shouted, her composure finally cracking in front of millions of viewers. Vin Diesel didn't move an inch. His posture remained firm, grounded, almost immovable. When he responded, his voice was combat unyielding. "This is called standing up for myself," Vang said evenly. "Something you clearly didn't expect when you decided to ambush me with your little performance today." The studio felt frozen in time. Around the table, the other hosts exchanged frantic looks, eyes darting toward producers just off camera, silently begging for guidance, any solution to the unprecedented disaster unfolding live. No one spoke. No one dared to interrupt. The audience was completely silent. Not a cough. Not a whisper. They instinctively knew they weren't just watching an argument. They were witnessing a moment that would be replayed, dissected, and debated for years. Then, finally, a new voice cut through the tension. Anna Navarro, unusually quiet until now, leaned forward, her expression filled with concern and desperation. "Can we please remember we're all professionals here?" she said softly. "Can we try to have a constructive conversation?" Joy turned on her instantly, her eyes flashed with fury, the kind that comes when someone's authority, identity, and worldview are being challenged all at once. "Constructive?" Joy snapped. "There is nothing constructive about this." She gestured sharply toward Vang. "This man has shown complete disrespect for me, for this show, and for our audience." Vang straightened fully, drawing a slow breath. When he spoke, his voice carried finality. "No, Joy," he said firmly. "You've shown disrespect for me, for your audience, and for what this show is supposed to represent." The words landed hard. "I came here to connect with people," Vang continued. "To share something positive. To talk about creativity, about storytelling, about family and resilience." He shook his head slightly, and you turned it into a circus. The silence that followed was deafening. Even the camera crew had stopped adjusting angles, transfixed by the raw emotion crackling through the studio air. It felt as though everyone, hosts, producers, audience, crew, was holding the same breath. Joy sat frozen, her mouth opened, then closed, opened again, but no words came. For perhaps the first time in her long television career, she seemed to realize visibly, painfully, that she had pushed someone too far. But Vang wasn't finished. The dam had burst. Years of Hollywood politics, media manipulation, whispered attacks, and industry backstabbing poured out, not in rage, but in raw honesty. His voice was steady now, intense in a way that felt far more unsettling than his earlier shouting. "No one here was ready for this conversation," Vang said quietly. "But you had a chance to have a real one." He gestured around the studio. "Real conversation with someone who's lived through incredible experiences, someone who's worked with amazing people, someone who's watched this industry change, sometimes for better, sometimes for worse, over decades." He paused. Instead, he said, his eyes returning to Joy, "You chose to be a bully." Joy finally found her voice. It was shaky, defensive, stripped of its usual sharpness. "I am not a bully," she said. "I ask hard questions. That's my job." Vang let out a short laugh, but there was no humor in it, only disbelief. "Your job," he repeated. "Your job is supposed to inform, to entertain, maybe even to inspire." He leaned forward slightly, his tone unwavering, and said, "You use your platform to destroy people. You hide behind the excuse of journalism, but real journalists don't ambush their guests." The words hit with surgical precision. "Real journalists don't confuse rumors with facts," Vang continued. "They don't turn personal attacks into content, and they don't mistake cruelty for accountability." Joy looked stunned. Around her, the other hosts sat motionless, unsure whether to intervene or whether doing so would only make things worse. The producers were undoubtedly screaming in headsets, but no commercial break came. This moment was too big to interrupt. "You could have challenged me," Vang said. "You could have asked me tough questions about my choices, my mistakes, my growth." His voice softened, just slightly. "But you didn't want dialogue. You wanted dominance." He straightened, taking a step back at last. "And the moment that didn't work," he said, "you called it intimidation." Joy said nothing. The audience remained silent. And as the cameras continued to roll on The View, one truth settled over the studio like a heavy fog. This wasn't about a celebrity clash anymore. This was about power, about media responsibility, about what happens when confrontation replaces conversation. And no matter how the show tried to recover afterward, this moment would never be forgotten.